They treated her like dirt until she called the Pentagon, and this happened. A black woman in her 50s stood at the customer service counter of Meridian Insurance, her shoulders straight despite the condescending stares from employees who had already decided she didn't belong in their marble and mahogany lobby. Her name was Colonel Sarah Washington, though the nameplate on the desk and the sneering receptionist who had kept her waiting for 2 hours didn't know that. They saw only what their prejudices allowed. An older black woman in a simple dress, asking questions about a life insurance policy they assumed she couldn't afford. What they didn't know was that 27 years of military service had taught her patience, strategy, and the precise moment when diplomacy ended and action began. In her purse was a phone with a direct line to people who could reshape their world with a single conversation, but first she would give them every opportunity to do the right thing. Sarah had come to Meridian Insurance to settle her late husband's policy, a straightforward process that should have taken 30 minutes, but had stretched into a nightmare of bureaucratic humiliation that lasted 3 days. Marcus Washington had been a decorated Air Force pilot who died in a training accident, leaving behind $1 million life insurance policy that was supposed to provide security for Sarah's retirement and their daughter's college education. The policy had been in good standing for 15 years, premiums paid automatically from Marcus's military account. But when Sarah presented the death certificate and policy documents, the claims representative had looked at her with barely concealed skepticism. "These numbers seem unusually high for someone in your situation," the young white man had said, his voice dripping with the kind of casual racism that hides behind corporate politeness. "We'll need to verify everything thoroughly. This could take several months." The verification process had become an exercise in systematic degradation designed to make Sarah give up and go away. They demanded documents she had already provided, asked for proof of identity she had shown multiple times, and questioned every detail of Marcus's military service as if his 30-year career was somehow suspicious. Each day brought new requirements, new forms to fill out, new hoops to jump through, while Sarah's savings dwindled and bills accumulated. The office manager, a middle-aged white woman named Patricia Hoffman, treated Sarah like a potential fraud case rather than a grieving widow, speaking to her in the slow, loud voice people use when they assume someone is either stupid or lying. "Ma'am, I understand you're upset, but we have procedures," Patricia would say, her smile as fake as her sympathy. "Insurance fraud is a serious problem, and we have to be very careful with large claims like this." What none of them knew was that Sarah Washington was not just any grieving widow. She was a retired Air Force colonel with a distinguished career in military intelligence, a woman who had briefed generals and congressmen, who had clearance levels that required background investigations every 5 years. She had served in Iraq and Afghanistan, had been responsible for operations that saved thousands of lives, had earned medals and commendations that filled an entire display case in her home. But in the eyes of Meridian Insurance, she was just another black woman trying to claim money they assumed she didn't deserve. The disconnect between her actual accomplishments and their perception of her worth was so vast, it would have been comedic if it wasn't so devastating. Sarah bit her tongue and played their game, knowing that patience was often the most powerful weapon in her arsenal. The breaking point came when Patricia suggested that Sarah might be more comfortable working with someone from your community at a different insurance office across town, one that specialized in serving urban clients. The barely veiled suggestion that she should take her business somewhere more appropriate for people like her was delivered with the same fake smile that had accompanied every other insult. Sarah felt something cold and hard settle in her chest, a familiar sensation from her military days when she realized that diplomatic solutions had been exhausted and it was time to deploy more decisive measures. She had given them multiple opportunities to treat her with basic human dignity, had endured their condescension and prejudice with grace that would have impressed her drill sergeants. But patience had limits, and they had just crossed hers. That evening, Sarah sat in her home office, surrounded by framed photos of her military career and Marcus's Air Force commendations, and made a decision that would reshape everyone's understanding of who they had been mistreating. She opened her laptop and began typing a detailed report of everything that had happened at Meridian Insurance. Every slight, every delay, every moment of disrespect that had been heaped upon a decorated veteran's widow while she tried to access benefits her husband had died for. But this wasn't a complaint letter to a customer service department or a review on a website. This was an official communication to people who had the power to make insurance companies disappear overnight. People who understood that treating military families with disrespect was not just morally wrong, but potentially catastrophic for business. Sarah had kept detailed notes of every interaction, recorded every conversation legally, documented every instance of what any reasonable person would recognize as discriminatory treatment. Tomorrow, she would give them one final chance to make things right. And if they refused, she would show them what happened when you disrespected the wrong person's sacrifice. The next morning, Sarah returned to Meridian Insurance dressed in her full military dress uniform. Every ribbon and medal precisely positioned according to regulations she could recite from memory. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. Conversations stopped, heads turned, and the casual arrogance that had characterized her previous visits evaporated like morning mist. Patricia's eyes widened as she took in the uniform that clearly indicated high rank and significant service, the decorations that spoke of combat deployments and exceptional performance. "Ma'am," the receptionist stammered, suddenly unsure of the protocol for addressing someone whose uniform commanded respect that transcended the corporate hierarchy they were used to navigating. Sarah's bearing was unmistakably military. Spine straight, shoulders square, every movement precise and purposeful. She had spent decades in rooms where her presence could shift the balance of power, and that authority was as much a part of her as breathing. Patricia hurried over with a deference that was painful in its contrast to her previous condescension, her voice now carefully modulated to avoid any hint of the disrespect she had shown so casually before. "Colonel Washington, I'm so sorry for any confusion about your claim. I'm sure we can resolve this very quickly." The title hung in the air like an accusation, a reminder of exactly how badly they had misjudged the woman they had been dismissing and delaying for days. Sarah's response was measured and professional, but beneath the military courtesy was a steel that made Patricia's hands shake as she fumbled with paperwork. "Ms. Hoffman, I've given your company multiple opportunities to process my husband's claim with the respect due to a fallen serviceman's family. Your organization has chosen instead to subject me to treatment that I can only characterize as discriminatory and unprofessional." The claims manager who had questioned Sarah's documentation was summoned immediately, his previous skepticism replaced by nervous energy as he realized he had been challenging the credibility of someone whose security clearance was higher than most government officials. "Colonel, there seems to have been some miscommunication about your husband's policy," he said, his voice carefully neutral as he tried to navigate a situation that had become infinitely more complex than a simple insurance claim. Sarah's military records were impeccable, her credentials unquestionable, her service record a testament to dedication and sacrifice that made their previous treatment of her look not just wrong, but potentially criminal. The young man who had suggested fraud was now faced with the reality that he had accused a decorated war veteran of lying about her husband's military service. But Sarah wasn't interested in their sudden change of attitude or their nervous attempts to backtrack from weeks of disrespectful treatment. She had learned in the military that respect offered only under threat was worthless, that people who changed their behavior based solely on power calculations would revert to their true nature the moment they thought they could get away with it. "Your apologies are noted," she said calmly, "but they don't address the systematic issues that led to this situation. How many other military families have been subjected to similar treatment? How many widows and widowers have been denied their rightful benefits because your staff made assumptions based on race or perceived social status?" Her questions cut to the heart of what everyone in the room now understood was a much larger problem than one mishandled claim. Sarah placed a sealed envelope on Patricia's desk with the precision of someone delivering official orders. "This contains a detailed report of every interaction I've had with your company, including recorded conversations and documented instances of discriminatory treatment. I'm giving you 24 hours to not only process my husband's claim, but to conduct a full review of your procedures and provide a plan for ensuring this never happens to another military family. The envelope sat between them like a bomb waiting to detonate, its contents representing the kind of documentation that could destroy careers and companies if it reached the wrong hands. Patricia stared at it with growing horror, beginning to understand that the woman they had treated like a nuisance was someone with the connections and credibility to create problems they couldn't imagine. Sarah's next words confirmed their worst fears. If I don't see meaningful action within that time frame, I'll be making some phone calls that you really don't want me to make. Patricia spent that night researching Sarah Washington's military career, and what she found made her stomach churn with the realization of how catastrophically they had misjudged their situation. Colonel Washington had served as a senior intelligence officer in 2 major conflicts, had been responsible for operations that were still classified decades later, had briefed senators and cabinet members on matters of national security. Her commendations included a Bronze Star for valor in combat, a Legion of Merit for exceptional service, and decorations from 3 different allied nations. More terrifyingly, her current status as a retired colonel meant she maintained relationships throughout the military and intelligence communities, connections that could destroy Meridian Insurance with a few well-placed conversations. Patricia realized they hadn't just been rude to a customer. They had systematically disrespected a genuine American hero whose service record put most people's entire careers to shame. The next morning brought a revelation that sent shockwaves through Meridian's corporate structure. Sarah Washington wasn't just any retired colonel. She was the Sarah Washington whose strategic intelligence work had been credited with saving thousands of American lives during Operation Iraqi Freedom. Military websites featured articles about her groundbreaking analysis techniques, her innovative approaches to counterintelligence, her mentorship of an entire generation of intelligence officers. The woman they had treated like a potential fraud was mentioned in congressional testimony, quoted in military journals, and respected by people whose opinions could make or break entire government contractors. Patricia's hands shook as she called the regional manager, knowing that the conversation would likely end her career, but understanding that covering up the situation would be infinitely worse. The regional manager, David Chun, arrived within hours of Patricia's call, his face grim as he reviewed the documented evidence of how his office had treated a decorated war veteran. The recordings Sarah had made were devastating. Clear evidence of discriminatory treatment, unprofessional conduct, and systematic disrespect that violated not just company policy, but federal laws protecting military families. "How did this happen?" he demanded, though the answer was obvious to anyone willing to acknowledge the racial bias that had poisoned every interaction from the beginning. The staff had seen a black woman and assumed she was trying to claim benefits she didn't deserve, had questioned documentation they would have accepted without hesitation from a white claimant, had subjected her to delays and demands that had no basis in actual policy or procedure. But even as David scrambled to contain the damage, Sarah was already 3 steps ahead, her military training evident in the precision of her strategy. She had given them exactly 24 hours, and as that deadline approached, she placed a call that would change everything. The Pentagon has many phone numbers, but few people have access to the direct lines that bypass secretaries and assistants, the numbers that connect immediately to offices where decisions affecting entire industries are made daily. Sarah's call went through on the first ring, answered by someone who had served under her command in Afghanistan and now held a position in military procurement. "Colonel Washington," the voice said warmly, "what can I do for you?" The conversation that followed was brief, professional, and absolutely devastating in its implications for Meridian Insurance. Within 2 hours of Sarah's phone call, Meridian Insurance received a communication that made David Chin's blood pressure spike dangerously high. The Department of Defense was conducting an immediate review of all insurance companies that held contracts for military personnel, specifically focusing on their treatment of service members' families and their compliance with federal anti-discrimination laws. Meridian held hundreds of millions of dollars in military contracts, agreements that could be terminated immediately if they were found to be in violation of federal regulations protecting veterans and their families. The timing of this review, coming precisely 24 hours after Sarah's ultimatum, was not lost on anyone involved. The decorated colonel had given them one final chance to do the right thing. And when they had failed to meet that standard, she had activated connections that could destroy their company with bureaucratic precision that would have impressed Sun Tzu himself. The Pentagon review team arrived at Meridian's headquarters like a military operation, armed with subpoena power and access to every document, email, and recorded conversation in the company's history. Led by Brigadier General Jennifer Martinez, herself a protege of Sarah Washington's, the team conducted interviews with frightening efficiency, documenting a pattern of discriminatory treatment that extended far beyond Sarah's case. They found dozens of instances where military families had been subjected to excessive delays, inappropriate questioning, and systematic disrespect that violated every principle of honoring those who served. The review revealed that Meridian's verification procedures were applied almost exclusively to minority claimants, that white military families received their benefits with minimal scrutiny, while Black and Hispanic families faced months of bureaucratic obstacles designed to discourage legitimate claims. General Martinez's report was devastating in its clinical precision, documenting not just individual instances of discrimination, but systemic failures that went to the core of Meridian's corporate culture. The company had saved millions of dollars by creating barriers that prevented legitimate claimants from accessing their benefits, had essentially bet that military families wouldn't have the resources or connections to fight back against institutional discrimination. Patricia and her team had been following informal policies that had never been written down but were understood by everyone who worked there, make certain types of claimants jump through extra hoops, question their documentation more aggressively, assume fraud until proven otherwise. The strategy had worked for years because most people couldn't fight back effectively against a large corporation with unlimited legal resources. But Sarah Washington wasn't most people, and the connection she had built over nearly 3 decades of distinguished service gave her access to weapons that Meridian's executives had never imagined facing. Her phone call had triggered not just a Pentagon review, but investigations by the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and congressional committees that oversaw military affairs. Each agency brought its own enforcement powers, its own ability to impose sanctions that could range from fines to criminal prosecution to the complete termination of government contracts that represented half of Meridian's annual revenue. The woman they had tried to dismiss and delay had essentially declared war on their entire business model, and she was winning with the overwhelming superiority that comes from having truth, law, and institutional power on your side. David Chun found himself in congressional testimony within a week, sitting at a witness table while senators who had been briefed by Sarah personally asked pointed questions about his company's treatment of military families. The hearing was broadcast on C-SPAN, turning Meridian's discriminatory practices into national news and creating a public relations nightmare that no amount of corporate damage control could contain. "Mr. Chun," Senator Williams asked, his voice heavy with disgust, "are you telling this committee that your company routinely subjected decorated war veterans to treatment that can only be described as harassment and discrimination?" The question hung in the air like an executioner's blade, and David's stammering response only made the situation worse. Social media exploded with outrage as clips from the hearing went viral, showing a corporate executive trying to justify the unjustifiable. The financial impact was immediate and catastrophic. Meridian's stock price collapsed as investors realized the company faced potential criminal liability, massive civil lawsuits, and the loss of government contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The Department of Defense suspended all existing contracts pending the outcome of the investigation, effectively cutting off the company's primary revenue stream overnight. Other insurance companies quietly began distancing themselves from Meridian's practices, afraid that association with systemic discrimination would taint their own government relationships. Sarah had achieved in 1 week what years of complaints and lawsuits had failed to accomplish. She had made discrimination so expensive that no rational business could continue engaging in it. The phone call that started as a widow seeking justice for her husband's sacrifice had become a corporate earthquake that would reshape an entire industry's approach to serving military families. Sarah's transformation from customer to catalyst was complete, but her work was far from finished. The Pentagon investigation had uncovered evidence that Meridian's discriminatory practices were part of a larger pattern affecting insurance companies across the country, all of whom had discovered that military families, particularly minority families, were less likely to have the resources or connections to fight back against claim denials and delays. Sarah found herself testifying before Congress, not as a victim, but as an expert witness, her military credentials and documented evidence providing unassailable credibility to reform efforts that have been stalled for years. "Senators," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had brief presidents, "when we ask young men and women to serve their country, we promise their families that their sacrifice will be honored. These companies have violated that sacred trust for profit, and they must be held accountable." The reforms that followed were swift and comprehensive, driven by the combination of public outrage and political pressure that Sarah's case had generated. The Military Family Protection Act passed both houses of Congress with overwhelming bipartisan support, creating federal oversight of insurance companies that served military personnel and establishing criminal penalties for systematic discrimination against service members' families. The law included provisions that Sarah had personally drafted, drawing on her intelligence background to create enforcement mechanisms that would be nearly impossible to circumvent or evade. Insurance companies would now face random audits, mandatory reporting of claim processing times by demographic categories, and the threat of losing all government contracts if patterns of discrimination were discovered. Meridian Insurance became the first company prosecuted under the new law, with Patricia and several other executives facing federal criminal charges for conspiracy to deprive military families of their civil rights. The company agreed to a settlement that included $200 million in damages to affected families, the creation of a victim compensation fund administered by the Department of Veterans Affairs, and a complete restructuring of their claims processing procedures under federal oversight. Patricia's fake smiles and condescending attitude had cost her company more money than they had saved through years of discriminatory delays, proving that institutionalized racism was not just morally wrong, but catastrophically expensive when it encountered someone with the power to fight back effectively. Sarah used her newfound platform to establish the Washington Foundation for Military Family Justice, named in honor of her late husband's service and dedicated to ensuring that other families would never face the discrimination she had endured. The foundation provided legal representation for military families facing insurance discrimination, educational resources about veterans' rights, and advocacy for continued reforms in how government contractors treated service members. Sarah's phone, the same device she had used to call the Pentagon, now received calls from military families across the country who needed help navigating bureaucratic obstacles designed to deny them benefits they had earned through sacrifice and service. The foundation's success rate was nearly perfect, partly because of Sarah's military connections, but mostly because insurance companies had learned that discriminating against military families now carried consequences they couldn't afford to face. The ripple effects of Sarah's victory extended far beyond insurance reform, inspiring other veterans to speak out about discrimination they had faced in healthcare, housing, and employment. Her story became a case study in military leadership programs, an example of how strategic thinking and institutional knowledge could be deployed to achieve objectives that seemed impossible through conventional channels. Young officers studied her approach, the careful documentation, the graduated escalation, the precise application of pressure at the exact moment when it would be most effective. Sarah had demonstrated that military skills were transferable to civilian battles, that the same strategic thinking that won wars could be used to win justice for people who had been systematically oppressed by institutions that thought they were too powerful to be challenged. But perhaps the most important outcome was the message Sarah's victory sent to corporate America. Military families were not victims to be exploited, but heroes to be honored, and treating them with disrespect would result in consequences that could destroy entire companies. The woman who had walked into Meridian Insurance as a grieving widow, seeking simple justice, had emerged as a force for institutional change that would protect thousands of families for generations to come. Her phone call to the Pentagon had been more than a request for help. It had been a declaration that service members' sacrifices would be respected, their families protected, and their dignity defended by people with the power to make those principles mean something in the real world. 2 years after her devastating victory over Meridian Insurance, Sarah Washington sat in her new office at the Pentagon, not as a visiting witness, but as the newly appointed director of military family advocacy, a position created specifically to address the systemic issues her case had exposed. The walls were lined with commendations from grateful military families. Thank you letters from children whose college educations had been secured by the benefits their fallen parents had earned, and photos from ceremonies honoring veterans whose sacrifices were finally being recognized with the dignity they deserved. Sarah's phone, the same device that had brought down a billion-dollar company, now served as a hotline for military families facing discrimination, a direct connection to someone who understood both their struggles and the institutional power needed to address them effectively. The transformation in how insurance companies treated military families was dramatic and irreversible. The industry had learned that discrimination was not just morally wrong, but financially catastrophic, that the cost of treating service members' families with disrespect far exceeded any short-term savings from delayed claims. Companies now competed to demonstrate their commitment to military families, hiring veterans as claims processors, establishing expedited procedures for service-related benefits, and creating customer service protocols that reflected the respect these families had earned through sacrifice. Sarah's case had become legendary in business schools as an example of how institutional discrimination could create existential threats to companies that thought they were too big to be challenged by individual customers. Patricia Hoffman, the former office manager whose condescending attitude had triggered this avalanche of consequences, now worked at a small insurance agency processing routine claims for half her previous salary. Her career in management had ended the day federal investigators played recordings of her suggesting that Sarah find someone from your community to help with her claim. The criminal charges had been dropped as part of the settlement, but her reputation in the insurance industry was permanently destroyed, a cautionary tale about the price of treating military families with disrespect. She spent her days processing claims with meticulous care, knowing that any hint of discriminatory treatment would result in immediate termination and possible federal prosecution. The woman who had once wielded petty corporate power with casual cruelty now understood that everyone deserved basic dignity, regardless of their perceived status or social position. David Chun had suffered an even more spectacular fall, his testimony before Congress becoming a viral sensation that destroyed his career and served as a masterclass in how not to respond to accusations of institutional discrimination. The company he had once run was now under permanent federal oversight, its every decision monitored by investigators who reported directly to Sarah's office. Meridian's executives had learned that military families were not just customers, but constituents of people with real power, that treating them poorly would result in consequences that extended far beyond negative reviews or canceled policies. The industry's transformation was so complete that other corporations began adopting similar protections for veterans and their families, understanding that respect for military service was not just good public relations but essential business practice. The Washington Foundation had grown into a national organization with offices in every state, staffed by veterans who understood the unique challenges military families faced when dealing with corporate bureaucracies that had never been held accountable for their treatment of service members. Sarah's approach had been replicated hundreds of times. Careful documentation, strategic escalation, and the precise application of institutional pressure to achieve objectives that seemed impossible through conventional channels. The Foundation's success rate remained near perfect. Not because they won every case, but because companies had learned that discriminating against military families would result in federal investigations, congressional hearings, and public relations disasters that could destroy their businesses overnight. The little girl whose father had died serving his country could now attend any college in America, her education secured by benefits that had been delayed but not denied, protected by laws that Sarah had helped write and enforce. Marcus Washington's sacrifice had been honored not just through his widow's persistence, but through systemic changes that would protect thousands of other military families from the discrimination Sarah had faced. The phone call that had seemed like a desperate last resort had become the first shot in a war against institutional discrimination that was still being fought and won every day by people who understood that service members' sacrifices demanded respect, not rhetoric. Sarah often thought about that moment in Meridian's office when Patricia had suggested she find help from someone in your community, not understanding that Sarah's community included generals and senators, intelligence officers and Pentagon officials, people who had served alongside her in some of the most dangerous places on Earth and who would never allow her sacrifice or her husband's memory to be dishonored by corporate prejudice. The phone in her desk drawer, the same device that had connected her to the Pentagon on that crucial day, now served as a reminder that military families were never really alone, that the bonds forged in service created networks of support that could move mountains and reshape industries when justice demanded action. If this story moved you, maybe it's the sign you needed today. If it is, subscribe. The woman who had walked into an insurance office seeking simple respect had emerged as a guardian of military families everywhere, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice is a phone call to the right person at exactly the right moment. They had treated her like dirt until she reminded them who she really was. And in doing so, she had changed the world for everyone who would come after her.